Hello, everyone. Um, Here we go. So my name is Raea Lovett. I am a sophomore in the Silver School of Social Work, and I'm majoring in social work as well as journalism. I did want to say thank you to my faculty sponsor, Dr. Adam Brooks, who helped me with the independent study portion, but also just helped be a guide through this entire process, and also all of the faculty and staff here at Gallatin, as well as Silver, who supported me during this fellowship. So this summer, I worked with queer migrants and specifically asylum seekers and refugees in Barcelona, Spain. And as a research focus, I looked at building human rights from the ground up. So we'll get into that throughout the presentation. So yes, this is a map of Catalonia, Spain. So Barcelona is in Catalonia, and these are some of the different agencies that funded ACATI, which is the organization I worked with. ACATI provides a number of different services, including a housing program across this entire region, but also support with like legal support, immigration support, writing asylum applications. So there were sort of two main components of my work. So there was the social work side where I was working with ACATI social workers to provide aid to our clients, many of whom did not speak Spanish, even though our social workers only did. And so I would help translate for them, and we'll get into some of the demographics of the clients we worked with in the next slide. But that was the social work side of what I did. And then the other side was working on global and international projects through the Erasmus Plus program. So these were education projects. One was focused on migration and lifelong learning with migrants and refugees, and the other was working on conceptualizations of gender. So this is a brief overview of sort of the world, LGBTQ rights in the world. And you'll see here most of the migrants that we worked with were from Latin America. That's because of the cultural, linguistic, and a number of other similarities between Latin America and Spain because of a history of colonization. Also, Spain does have preferential immigration policies for refugees and migrants from Latin America. But as you can see, this was a chart that I created in the work of my summer project, mapping transgender murders in countries with more than 100 per year over the years. And as you can see, it's kind of difficult. There used to be trend lines in this, but there is a slight upward trend in this. So many of the refugees that we worked with were trans and gender nonconforming people who had faced violence and a number of different atrocities and human rights violations. You can also see the other areas that I worked with, especially in the context of our English-speaking migrants who did not speak Spanish, were coming largely from Africa, the Middle East, as well as Russia and Ukraine. And so, again, talking about the intersectionality of these global human problems that Vasuki had mentioned in the first slide, it really is something that these different human rights atrocities in different parts of the world affect other areas as well. So I want to focus on some social work considerations when working with queer refugees and trans asylum seekers. And I want to focus on one on this list specifically. You guys can read the rest. But that's the queer credibility paradox. And this is something I was coming across a lot in my research, which is that if you're coming from a country of origin that's not safe for queer or trans people, typically you learn how to hide your identity, right, to keep you safe. And there becomes a point where you must seek asylum, where, and that becomes your reality. And so we would work with asylum seekers who would be from countries of origin where that was not safe for them. But they would then have a very hard time opening up in their asylum applications about their queer identities, right? The asylum officers, the immigration officers who would interview them were often not members of the community, and they would have ideas about what a queer person should be, how they should act, especially based on the context in Spain. And the same can be said, especially for trans people, for example, many of whom did not have access to transitions in their country of origin, and now they were faced with having to prove their trans identity. And so that's what I sort of came across in my research, and I'm calling the queer credibility paradox, or the idea that queer people need to prove themselves in the asylum process, or all people need to prove themselves in the asylum process, but that can be especially difficult for queer people. And lastly, I want to talk about just the last part of my project, which was this idea of building human rights from the ground up. So as all of the fellows and I learned in our project, human rights are these great big international legal instruments. And they're really great in that it helps us cement a framework for how to make sure that people's basic needs are being met. But there is an issue, and that is that oftentimes people, especially the most vulnerable people like the queer asylum seekers that I was working with, can't actually access those rights because of a number of different factors, including notably linguistic factors. And part of what I think as a human rights field we need to do is start acknowledging that human rights must come from the top down, but they also must come from the bottom up. And I think that that's the work of social workers. I think it's the work of litigators. I think there's a whole team of people who should be involved in this process, but it is a need. And I think a lot of the organizations that we worked with this summer could fit into the idea of building human rights from the ground up, but I think it's something that should be more widely considered in the human rights discussion that we do have. So thank you all so much.